So good to see you guys connecting with one another. That's what church is about. It's family, it's community, it's friendship, taking care of each other. Good morning. If you're new with us, my name is Phil, one of the pastors here at Hope City. Just to catch you up on what we've been doing for Lent, we started a series on contemplative Christian spirituality because we really want to encourage and also equip you to experiment with at least one contemplative practice this year. We want to help you as a follower of Jesus connect with God, because you can learn a lot about God in a Bible study. You'll get information about God. You can hear about what someone else thinks about God in a sermon, right? Hopefully, information from Bible study, hopefully some inspiration from the sermon. But in order to connect with the Spirit of the living God, you need to practice contemplative Christian spirituality. That's the way that we encounter the Spirit of God. I have not found any other way to experience God's Spirit than through these contemplative practices. I wish there were another way. I don't think there is. If you're after information, go for the Bible study. If you're after some inspiration, come to a sermon, or there's a ton of great stuff on YouTube as well, right? But if you really want to experience God's Spirit, it's the contemplative practices. That's the way that we slow down. That's the way that we can hear God. That's the way that we can sense His presence. And so for our series, we'll be exploring different contemplative spiritual practices. Today, we're talking about solitude and silence, more so on silence today. Next week, we're going to talk about fasting. And then we're going to talk about Lectio Divina. This is like a holy reading of Scripture where we read, again, not for information, but for encounter. And then we're going to talk about Sabbath. What does it mean for us to dedicate time and space, to slow down and to hear God's voice, to celebrate? As Andrew said, Jessica Chan is coming for Good Friday, and it's going to be an experience, not just teaching, but a whole experience with regards to how we practice lament. Really looking forward to this. And then for Easter, yes, we are resurrection people. We need to learn how to practice joy on a regular basis as well. Add that to our rhythm. And so that's where we're going. Last week, we talked about solitude. This week, we're going to focus a little bit more on silence, but they are constant companions. You cannot find one without the other. And the passage that we've been camping around to experience God through the Scriptures comes from 1 Kings. This is chapter 19, verses 1 to 19. And just allow me to read it for us. I want us to enter into the story. Imagine if you were Elijah, you were experiencing some of these things. And from here, I want to dive again into a conversation about solitude and silence. Reads like this. Now Ahab had told Jezebel everything Elijah had done and how he had killed all the prophets with the sword. That is, the prophets of Baal. So Jezebel sent a messenger to Elijah to say, "May the gods deal with me, be it ever so severely, if by this time tomorrow I do not make your life like that of one of them." Elijah was afraid and ran for his life. When he came to Beersheba in Judah, he left his servant there, and while he himself went on a day's journey into the wilderness, he came to a broom bush, sat down under it, and prayed that he might die. "I have had enough, Lord," he said. "Take my life. I am no better than my ancestors." Then he lay down under the bush and fell asleep. All at once an angel touched him and said, "Get up and eat." He looked around, and there by his head was some bread baked over hot coals and a jar of water. He ate and drank and then lay down again. The angel of the Lord came back a second time and touched him and said, "Get up and eat, for the journey is too much for you." So he got up and ate and drank, and strengthened by that food, he traveled 40 days and 40 nights until he reached Horeb, the mountain of God. There he went into a cave and spent the night. And the word of the Lord came to him. "What are you doing here, Elijah?" He replied, "I have been very zealous for the Lord God Almighty. The Israelites have rejected your covenant, torn down your altars, and put your prophets to death with the sword. I am the only one left, and now they are trying to kill me too." The Lord said, "Go out and stand on the mountain in the presence of the Lord, for the Lord is about to pass by." Then a great and powerful wind tore the mountains apart and shattered the rocks before the Lord. But the Lord was not in the wind. After the wind, there was an earthquake, but the Lord was not in the earthquake. After the earthquake came a fire, but the Lord was not in the fire. And after the fire came a gentle whisper. When Elijah heard it, he pulled his cloak over his face and went out and stood at the mouth of the cave. Then a voice said to him, "What are you doing here, Elijah?" He replied, "I have been very zealous for the Lord God Almighty. The Israelites have rejected your covenant, torn down your altars, and put your prophets to death with the sword. I am the only one left, and now they are trying to kill me too." The Lord said to him, "Go back the way you came, and go to the desert of Damascus. When you get there, anoint Hazael king over Aram. Also anoint Jehu, son of Nimshi, king over Israel, and anoint Elisha, son of Shaphat, from Abel Meholah, to succeed you as prophet. Jehu will put to death any who escape the sword of Hazael, and Elisha will put to death any who escape the sword of Jehu. Yet I reserve 7,000 in Israel, all whose knees have not bowed down to Baal, and whose mouths have not kissed him." So Elijah went from there and found Elisha, son of Shaphat. He was plowing with 12 yoke of oxen, and he himself was driving the 12th pair. Elijah went up to him and threw his cloak around him. This is the word of the Lord. Last week we talked about solitude. Not going to go into it too much today, just a little bit. But if you want to, it's online. It's on YouTube on our channel. But solitude is symbolized by the broom tree. It's this bush, about 8 feet tall, that Elijah falls asleep under. Last week, we talked about how we are driven to solitude and silence, not just by our search for God, but usually out of desperation. When life conspires and it leaves us without a foothold, it leaves us, overwhelmed, we seek God in ways we have not before, in solitude and silence. And in solitude, what we do is we set aside the people and the things that we normally depend on. We're on our own. We're without any supplies. And God ministers to us. And that's what we talked about last week, that in solitude we experience a God who shelters us underneath the broom tree, and a God who restores us, provides for us miraculously. This hot bread baked over the hot coals, and water in a pitcher in the middle of a desert. It's like the manna that the Israelites experienced, and it's like the water from the rock that they also experienced as they were wandering in the desert. That's solitude. This week we're going to talk about silence, which is symbolized by this gentle whisper that Elijah encounters. He hears it, and somehow he knows that the presence of God is in that whisper. And solitude and silence are these constant companions. Solitude is the practice of being with God in what is true about me right now. That's what solitude is. In solitude, our souls rest in God by simply being with God, no matter what is happening inside us or around us. Ruth Haley Barton describes this kind of like the game of musical chairs. How many of you have ever played the game of musical chairs before, whether as a child, or with your kids, right? All of us have played this game of musical chairs somewhere during our lives, right? During the time of our lives. During the pandemic, Kayla, our youngest, wanted to play musical chairs with us because she could not play musical chairs with her friends, right? And so here we are, just our little family, our little bubble, and we actually invited Grandma and Grandpa to come and play with us too. So this was like an all ages, 3-generation kind of affair of musical chairs. She was only 2 at the time. And when you play musical chairs and you kind of align it, or you see that as an analogy for solitude, the practice of solitude is kind of like musical chairs in the sense that when the music of life plays, right? That's when you move. You are circling those chairs. You move. You're going around and around those chairs. But when the music of life stops, you kind of sit down right where you are. Or if you're like, me, you're trying to grab the chair from somebody else or something like that, right? But you're supposed to just sit down where life puts you as the music stops. And that's where you are. Your heart could be pounding, you could be sweaty, you could be out of breath, you could be triumphant. You landed in a chair, or you could be disappointed. And what we learned very, very quickly playing with Kayla, right, who was 2 at that time, is it's very important for her to win, or else it just ruins the entire experience for everyone else. And so we had to get it across very quickly. Not so much to Micah. There's about 7-year gap between the 2 of them. Like, he understood, let the little one win. This is just musical chairs. Who cares, right? But we had to let my middle child know, yes, please, from time to time, let the small one who can barely climb into the chair sit in the chair. It's good for her to win. And when the music stops, sometimes you're triumphant. Sometimes you're in the place where you want to be. Or sometimes when the music stops, you're left without a chair and it's disappointing. But solitude is just like that. It's learning to be with God just as we are, where there's no pretense. Elijah here, as we find him, is done with life. He is done with ministry. He has already done all that he can do spectacularly in ministry, and found that it has not moved the needle 1 inch in terms of the idolatry in the country, in Israel. He just wants to die. So solitude is the practice of just being with God in whatever is true in our lives in the here and now. Silence is different, but it's related. Silence is the practice of letting God speak into my life. In silence, we let God care for our souls as only he can. We let him speak words that we won't hear from anywhere else or anyone else. There are words that he will speak to you and me that only he can say. Henry Nouwen says it like this: silence completes and intensifies solitude. When we practice solitude, we remove ourselves from the noisiness of our world, not just from the presence and opinions of other people. Sometimes people can be annoying, right? And so, yes, we seek solitude from them. But other times, our people, our friends are well-meaning, they're helpful, they're loving, and we want to go to them. But solitude is even saying no to them, even to the good people, because we know we ultimately need to learn at some point of our lives to depend on God, to hear from God, not just from others. So solitude is just removing ourselves from the presence and distractions of others, whether that is annoying or whether that's well-meaning. Solitude also means that we remove ourselves from the distractions that we normally turn to in order to numb ourselves to the pain of our lives or the anxiety that we feel as we look at what's ahead. And I'm going to be honest with you. In my pain, in my anxiety, what I turn to most is stories And you might think, oh, wow, that's literature. How high-minded. No, I'm just talking about binging Netflix, right? That's how I numb sometimes, is getting lost in stories. Or, and I've talked about this before too, I turn to food as well. I don't have a healthy relationship with food. Food is a wonderful thing that God gives us, but I turn to it sometimes to numb anxiety or pain. That's not a healthy relationship with food. And so solitude means not just turning away from people and opinions, but also from distractions that we normally turn to numb ourselves. And solitude may even take one step further. It's even turning away from good things that we can learn from and grow from. Podcasts, books, lots of great stuff out there that will teach our souls. But solitude is saying, I'm in a place in my life where I truly need to experience the presence of God and to hear his voice above all else. I have done everything else, and it will not do. I need his presence. I need to hear his voice. That's solitude. And then when it comes to practicing silence, what we do is not just seek out places of silence, but we learn how to be silent. We learn how to refrain from speaking. We learn to stop trying to explain ourselves or to verbally process and figure out the situations for ourselves. We come to a place where we are ready, desperate, in need of a word from God. When we combine the practice of solitude with the practice of silence, we begin to learn how to listen. We begin to learn how to be present to God and to listen to his voice. And that's what this passage of Scripture tells us about God. That God is not found in the roar of a tornado or a hurricane. God is not found in the tremor of an earthquake. That God is not found in this fiery blast of an inferno, but instead, God is found in a gentle whisper. God is not found in the spectacular, but God is found in the ordinary. God is not found in the obvious and the overwhelming, but God is found in the subtle. If we think about this, the last time that Elijah experienced the power of God was when fire fell from the sky and consumed that entire sacrifice and altar that he set up and that he soaked with water. That was the last time he experienced the power of God, was in fire. And as that progression goes, it was not in wind, the power of the wind. It was not in the power of the earthquake, and it was not in the power of fire, not in the spectacle where God is to be found. Somehow God appears to him, not as he appeared to him the last time he experienced him, but in something rather ordinary instead, in something subtle. We live in a noisy world. I'm going to show you this slide. It's a slide on sound levels, and there's decibels, and there's all sorts of different ways of looking at sound, but we can look at the more dangerous aspects of sound. I can't believe I'm talking about this. I sound more my age as I talk about this. That sound can be dangerous. That things can be dangerous. But I feel this, right? Like there's intolerable sound where if you look it up and can you see it? Oh my goodness. Okay. So my eyes can barely see it. Apologies for those of you who are in the back. But intolerable sound would be like fireworks 1 meter away from you. That's 150 decibels. That's intolerable sound. Kind of dialing back from there, the threshold of pain is a jackhammer at the source of a jackhammer. And that's why those guys wear those headphones, right? Wear ear protection. That's 130 decibels. And that's when you start to feel pain. Like sound can cause you pain. And the very first time I experienced this was in high school. I went to my very first concert. My parents let me go to GM Place, Rogers Arena at that time, to hear Our Lady Peace. And so that kind of gives you a sense of my musical taste during high school. It was alternative, right? And I learned right away at that Our Lady Peace concert is that I am not as hardcore as I thought I was. Because it was so loud. I felt like there was this one speaker that was just pointed in my direction, and my ears literally hurt. I'd never experienced that before in my life, right? And I spent most of the concert like this. I'm looking at Maxine. She's an audiologist. She's like, there's probably so much hearing damage, which explains a lot at this point, right? I should have just held my ears, and I think I did through most of the concert. It was a terrible experience. Now when I go to concerts, I bring earplugs just in case, right? That would be the wise thing to do. Wish I talked to Maxine before I went. The threshold of pain, 130 decibels. Hearing loss can happen at around 100 to 120 decibels. And this is like a passing ambulance, a chainsaw, a motorcycle passing you. And then hearing loss from prolonged exposure at 90 to 80 decibels. This is a vacuum cleaner, so be careful, okay? Maybe we shouldn't clean as much, right? Or wear hearing, protection while we are vacuuming, right? Shouted conversation, right? Be careful who you are arguing with, right? Damages your hearing. Or busy traffic, right? We can understand this. We live in a noisy world. Medical researchers tell us that if we're exposed to these high levels of noise over a long period of time, not only will our hearing be damaged, but our bodies actually produce more stress hormones in the long term. And what this does is this elevates our blood pressure. This increases the risk of heart disease. And therefore, removing noise is good for us. I have found that when Grace and I are in the car and the kids ask for music, we are now those parents that are like, it's too loud, let's turn this down. Or silence would be very nice. And I remember the very first time we did this, it made me think of the time when I was a teenager playing music in my mom and dad's car, and they did the same thing. They were like, my blood pressure can't take this. And now I know it's true. We're all walking along that path, just one after the other. We live in a noisy world. It's good to limit our exposure, not just to noise and sound, but there's quiet places we can seek too. So the moderate to quiet would be a normal conversation. This would be rainfall. A quiet room in your home, that's 60 to 40 decibels. Faint sound would be a library at 30 decibels. A whisper, and this is what we're talking about in this passage here. A whisper, someone whispering to you at around 2 meters away, that's 20 decibels. And when you just sit in a room and hear yourself breathing, that's about 10 decibels. Right? And so a gentle whisper is 20 decibels. A gentle whisper is not silent. God is not silent. But to hear him, we need to be silent. We need to stop speaking. We need to stop running to places where we are distracted by the noise or overwhelmed by the noise. At 0 decibels, you have the theoretical limit of hearing, right? That's silence. I did a little bit of research. I learned that in the world, there are these anechoic chambers that are produced. And Microsoft actually built one, in Washington. In terms of decibels, it's minus 20.3 decibels. It's an acoustically isolated room. It provides unchanging, guaranteed silence. You can't hear wild animals, wind, or any other human noise that's created in the world. You have to go through 3 sets of doors to reach this chamber. It's a room within a room. And to make the place silent, there are sets of heavy walls that are insulated from this inner room. It stops the outside noise from entering. And then the chamber itself is mounted on springs to prevent unwanted vibrations from entering in. A couple of things stand out visually. When you walk into the room, you're actually standing on a wire floor, kind of like a trampoline, but this trampoline doesn't bounce. Underneath the wire floor is the true floor, and you'll notice that covering every single surface of this entire room, whether it's the ceiling, the walls, or even the true floor beneath, are these large wedges of gray foam that absorb sound vibration. Those who have the privilege of experiencing this space will note that it's an unbelievably quiet space. And if you walk in and if you were to have a conversation with someone, it sounds different from the normal world. Everything sounds muffled because your voice, whatever you're saying, gets absorbed before it bounces back to your ears. It sounds muffled. The room is not silent, though, even though the room, absorbs all sound. The room is so quiet that you begin to hear all the sounds that your body is actually making that, it can't dampen. People report that they start to hear hissing in their ears, that there's a low pulsing, and that researchers believe this is the sound of blood circulating. It's so quiet in this room, you can hear your blood circulate in your body around your ears. If you stand still long enough, you can hear your own heartbeat. And when you move, you can hear your joints creak. They say when you turn your head from side to side, it is so quiet in there that you can hear everything sliding around. People report that over time they start to lose their balance. And this is sort of the absolute lack of reverberation in the room. It messes with our brain's ability to generate spatial awareness. And so this is the anechoic chamber. This is pure silence, if that's what we're seeking. And again, I want to emphasize that the practice of being silent is different from seeking places that are completely silent. That is impossible for us to find in our world, right? Impossible. So if we're not seeking complete silence, if the practice is us learning how to pause from speaking, there are natural soundscapes, though. Maybe this is what we should be seeking in terms of places that will resonate and help us as we practice silence. Researchers have looked for space in the United States, at least. I don't know about Canada. I think Canada, if we go as far north as possible, there's lots of these spaces. But for Americans, this is what they found. They found that there's this one space that is free from artificial human noise, including aircraft noise. And they've named this place the 1 square inch of silence on the U.S. map. Okay, 1 square inch of silence. And this is a place actually not far from us. It's in the United States, and it's in the Olympic National Park in Washington State. It's called, and I don't know how to pronounce this, okay? It's H-O-H. Is that the Ho rainforest, right? Or is that the Ho rainforest? I don't know, okay? But that's what it's called. It's this place that is free of flight paths that crisscross the sky, any man-made noises. And again, this place is not free from the absence of sound. There's noisy animals. There's birds there that live in this lush canopy of evergreen trees. There is a high level of rainfall, which produces, sounds of rushing waters and creeks. And what the National Park Service has found is that this is a natural soundscape, and it's natural soundscapes that actually produce in us human beings essential elements of tranquility. So silence is not what brings us tranquility, it's these natural soundscapes. Natural soundscapes have this quality and this emotional connection in us that is very similar. And again, this is the words of the National Park Board. They say it's very similar to what we find in churches. I don't know how this high school gym relates to that, but when you imagine going into a quiet sanctuary, a cathedral, and you find a seat at a pew, maybe midway through or at the back, and you just have time and space to quiet yourselves, they're saying going out and visiting a forest, walking around in a natural soundscape, does something to our hearts and minds that's similar to when we sit at a church for some time, where people become very sensitive to the sounds around them, but not in a stressful way, but in a way that relaxes us. I think this is the tranquil posture of listening. It somehow tunes our ability to hear, not just with our ears, but with our souls. That's what seeking out these natural soundscapes, these quieter places, will do for us. Scripture tells us that God meets Elijah as a gentle whisper. I wonder what this means for us. I wonder if this is how the Spirit of God speaks to us. That the Spirit of God speaks to us gently, quietly, softly, drawing us in, maybe speaking quietly so that we have to lean in order to hear his voice. I think about the teachers, and again, we're at a school. I know there's a lot of teachers here. Teachers who have a ton of experience building rapport with their class, where teachers can command the attention of a class no matter how rowdy they get, not by shouting over them, being louder than them, but by speaking gently, quietly, which requires the students to pay attention, to lean in, and to listen. And I wonder if this is what God does with us as well. What if God speaks to us in a gentle whisper because it tunes our ability to listen, our intention to listen? God meets Elijah as a gentle whisper. What if the way God's presence is communicated to us in this analogy tells us about who God is and what he is like? That this God is actually gentle with us. He doesn't try to overwhelm us. His presence is not in the wind, the tornado. His presence is not in the earthquake. His presence is not in the intensity of that fire where we fear. That this God does not try to overwhelm us. This God is not coercive with us. But rather his presence is this gentle whisper. God doesn't try to blow us away with his power. He's not in that tornado. God does not try to shake us up and pull the rug out from under us, surprise us. He's not found in that earthquake. God doesn't turn up the heat and force us to him. He's not found in that fire. He's found in this gentle whisper. Therefore, this is a God who tells me that he is listening first and foremost. He's not just calling us to listen, but if he's found in a gentle whisper, this is a God who listens, and he listens first. He's a God who listens. He's a God who hears. He's a God who listens before he speaks, even though he and he alone has the right to speak and to declare. But this is a God who listens. He hears what is spoken by us. He hears what is unspoken by us, what we figured out in life and what is still unresolved. He hears that. And out of all of his listening to us, he speaks. And therefore his presence, if we truly encounter his presence as a gentle whisper, his presence is God's unconditional acceptance of us. Receives us just as we are, knows us as we are. And his presence is God's unconditional love. He embraces us just as we are. There's a Roman Catholic Trappist monk. He wrote this book on centering prayer. And he says this. His name is M. Basil Pennington. And I love what he says here. He says, God is infinitely patient. He will not push himself into our lives. He knows the greatest thing he has given us is our freedom. If we want habitually, even exclusively, to operate from the level of our own reason, he will respectfully keep silent. We can fill ourselves with our own thoughts, ideas, images, and feelings. He will not interfere. But if we invite him with attention, opening the inner spaces with silence, he will speak to our souls, not in words or concepts, but in the mysterious way that love expresses itself, by presence. Let me read that again. I think this is gold right here. God is infinitely patient. He will not push himself into our lives. He knows the greatest thing he has given us is our own freedom. If we want habitually, even exclusively, to operate from the level of our own reason, he will respectfully keep silent. We can fill ourselves with our own thoughts, ideas, images, and feelings. He will not interfere. But if we invite him with attention, opening the inner spaces with silence, he will speak to our souls, not in words or concepts, but in the mysterious way that love expresses itself, by presence. I'm going to invite you, and this is sort of our practice during our series for Lent. We want to create time and space for us to experience some of this, to slow down, to have permission to not do much. We're just going to practice a little bit of silence here and now. So I invite you to just quiet yourself in God's presence by just taking a few deep breaths. Inhale deeply. Exhale slowly. As you silence the music of your life, is there anything that is hurting these days? Any grief that you've been holding in? It doesn't have to be big. It could be something that feels maybe insignificant, such as being left out of something you wanted to be included in. I want to invite you to allow whatever is weighing on your soul right now just to come to the surface. It could be something big, it could be something small, but just let it surface. I want to invite you to let yourself experience this grief. But as you do so with the awareness that you are not alone. You are in the presence of the one who loves you and bears your grief with you. And now turning a page, is there something that you are feeling grateful for these days? Where are you experiencing life and connection with God or with others? Now, as we close here, just allow this time for you to experience or express your gratitude for being in God's presence. You don't have to do anything except just allow his gentle whisper to surround you.